Have you ever wondered what happens when a fairy tale shatters? Not ends, but shatters into a million sharp-edged pieces? We are raised on stories of princesses who live in glittering palaces and marry handsome princes. But what happens to the princess when the palace is burned? The prince is a stranger, and the fairy tale itself becomes a ghost that haunts her every waking moment. Picture this: a crisp autumn morning in New York City, late in the 1920s. The air buzzes with the energy of a new world, a world of jazz, skyscrapers, and relentless ambition. Amidst the hustle of Fifth Avenue, a woman of regal bearing steps out of a yellow cab. Her coat is impeccably tailored. Her posture is bolt upright, a relic of a different time and place, but it's her eyes that would catch your attention. They hold a profound, ancient sadness, yet flicker with a resilient, unyielding fire. She isn't here to shop. She pushes through the revolving doors of Bergdorf Goodman, one of the world's most luxurious department stores, to begin her day as an employee. This woman was no ordinary New Yorker. She was Her Imperial Highness, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna of Russia, first cousin to the murdered Tsar Nicholas II, a direct descendant of the mighty Romanov dynasty that had ruled a sixth of the world for 3 centuries. Her life story is one of the most dramatic and improbable of the 20th century. It is an epic of loss, survival, and reinvention that stretches from the gilded, diamond-encrusted ballrooms of Imperial St. Petersburg to the gritty, unforgiving reality of life as a refugee. But this is more than just the story of a fallen royal. It is a deep psychological portrait of a woman forged in the crucible of tragedy. A woman who lost her mother before she could know her, was abandoned by her father, saw her guardian blown to pieces by a terrorist bomb, and was forced to flee her homeland with nothing but her wits and the jewels sewn into her clothes. This is the story of her lifelong desperate search for something she was never given, a sense of belonging, a place to call home, and a love that was unconditional. Join me as we uncover the astonishing life of the Grand Duchess, who survived the fall of an empire and refused to be defined by her past. To understand Maria, we must first step into her lost world, Russia at the twilight of the Romanovs. It was a world of breathtaking extremes. For the aristocracy, life was a spectacle of unimaginable wealth. Society revolved around the season in St. Petersburg, a relentless whirlwind of debutante balls, state banquets, and private masquerades that lasted from the first winter snow until the final days of Lent. The air in the grand halls of the Winter Palace, or the Anichkov Palace, seemed to shimmer with the light of 1,000 candles, reflecting off diamonds, sapphires, and emeralds. Women wore gowns from the finest Parisian couturiers, while men glittered in their dress uniforms, their chests heavy with medals and jeweled orders. This was a society governed by rigid etiquette, where the placement of a guest at a dinner table could signal political favor or ruin, and a misplaced word could lead to social exile. It was a world insulated by immense privilege, a gilded cage where the inhabitants sincerely believed their way of life was divinely ordained and would last forever. Yet beyond the palace walls, a vastly different Russia existed. This was a nation of over 100 million peasants, many of whom were just one generation removed from serfdom. They lived in grinding poverty, at the mercy of the harsh climate and a system that offered them little hope. In the burgeoning industrial cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, a new working class toiled in squalid factories, their discontent fueling the flames of revolutionary thought. Anarchists, nihilists, and Marxists met in secret, their whispers of change growing louder with each passing year. The empire was a slumbering giant, beautiful on the surface but deeply fractured within. The very ground Maria's cradle stood upon was volcanic. Her own grandfather, Tsar Alexander II, known as the Tsar Liberator for freeing the serfs, had been assassinated by a revolutionary's bomb in 1881. This brutal act plunged the dynasty into a state of paranoia. His successor, Maria's uncle Tsar Alexander III, responded with iron-fisted repression, rolling back his father's reforms and strengthening the secret police. The autocracy, the absolute power of the Tsar, was deemed the only thing that could hold the vast, unwieldy empire together. This was the Russia that Maria Pavlovna was born into on April 18, 1890, a world of glittering contradiction, of immense power and profound vulnerability. She was born into the very heart of this system. Her father was the handsome and charming Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich, the youngest and favorite son of the martyred Alexander II. Her mother was the exquisitely beautiful Princess Alexandra of Greece and Denmark, a granddaughter of the Danish king often called the father-in-law of Europe. Through her mother, Maria was related to nearly every royal house on the continent. She was a Romanov, a name that meant power, prestige, and a destiny intertwined with that of Russia itself. But from the very beginning, her destiny was marked not by privilege, but by tragedy. The marriage of Maria's parents was a genuine love match, a rarity in a world of dynastic arrangements. Grand Duke Paul was considered the most handsome of the Tsar's sons, a dashing cavalry officer with a gentle demeanor. Princess Alexandra, known to her family as Aline, was vibrant and full of life, adored by the Russian people for her charm and kindness. Their union in 1889 was celebrated as a fairy tale. They settled into their palace on the English embankment in St. Petersburg and spent idyllic summers at their country estate, Ilinsko, near Moscow. In the spring of 1890, their joy was completed with the birth of their first child, a daughter named Maria. For a brief, shining period, their life was perfect, but the fairy tale was destined for a brutal ending. In the late summer of 1891, the couple was at Ilinsko. Alexandra, 7 months pregnant with their second child, was in high spirits. One afternoon, surrounded by friends, she impulsively decided to jump from a riverbank into a waiting boat. The exact sequence of events is clouded by time, but it seems she either fell during the jump or the exertion was too much. She collapsed, overcome with violent labor pains. Chaos ensued. She was carried back to the house where she gave birth to a son, Dmitri. The baby was so premature, he was barely alive. Doctors kept him breathing by wrapping him in cotton wool and placing him in a cradle surrounded by hot water bottles. But the mother could not be saved. Alexandra never regained consciousness, and 6 days later, she died. She was only 21 years old. The death of his beloved Aline utterly destroyed Grand Duke Paul. He was consumed by a grief so profound it bordered on madness. He would stare at her portrait for hours, refusing to speak or eat. The court and all of Russia mourned with him. But in the grand tragedy, 2 tiny lives were forgotten. Maria was just 17 months old. Her brother Dmitri was a fragile newborn fighting for his life. Their lives began in a house cloaked in black crepe, their father a ghost wandering its halls, too lost in his own sorrow to even look at them. He couldn't bear the sight of his children, who were a painful reminder of the wife he had lost. This was Maria Pavlovna's foundational trauma, the first and deepest cut from which all others would grow. She was an orphan not by circumstance, but by grief. She and her brother were motherless, and in a profound emotional sense, fatherless as well. The Romanov dynasty, a family that prided itself on continuity, had failed its 2 newest members at the very start. Unable to cope, Grand Duke Paul entrusted his two infant children to his older brother, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, and his wife, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna. Known in the family as Ella, she was none other than the elder sister of the future. And last, Tsarina Alexandra. So Maria and Dmitri were packed off to Moscow to be raised in the imposing palace of the Governor-General. If they had hoped to find the warmth and affection they lacked, they were to be cruelly disappointed. Their new home was a place of rigid formality and emotional frost. Grand Duke Sergei was a complex figure. To the public, he was the iron fist of the autocracy, uncompromising, deeply conservative, and fiercely anti-Semitic. In private, he was devoutly religious and, according to Maria's own memoirs, showed genuine if awkward affection for the children. He was the only father figure she would know for a time, a stern but dedicated guardian. The real challenge, from Maria's perspective, was her aunt Ella, a legendary beauty revered by the world for her piety and grace, to the lonely, headstrong little girl in her care. She was a figure of cold, remote perfection. Ella and Sergei were a childless couple, and she seemed to possess no maternal instinct. She approached the task of raising her niece and nephew as a solemn duty, not a joy. Love and affection were replaced by a strict regimen of lessons, prayers, and formal appearances. In her memoir, The Education of a Princess, Maria would later write about this period with a chilling lack of sentimentality. She described an upbringing devoid of simple, human touches. There were no spontaneous hugs, no bedtime stories, no comforting words after a childhood fall. Ella, she felt, was always judging her, finding her too loud, too impulsive, too unlike the quiet, docile child a Grand Duchess was supposed to be. Maria, starved for love, reacted with defiance and stubbornness, creating a cycle of conflict and disapproval that defined her childhood. Her world was a gilded cage. She was surrounded by priceless art, attended by dozens of servants, and wore the finest clothes. But her emotional needs were completely unmet. And soon, she and Dmitri would suffer a second, devastating abandonment. Their father, Grand Duke Paul, eventually began to emerge from his grief. He fell in love with a beautiful, intelligent woman named Olga von Pistolkors. There was just one problem. She was a commoner, and a divorcee at that. According to the strict laws of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Romanov house rules, such a marriage was impossible for a Grand Duke in the direct line of succession. Paul begged his nephew, Tsar Nicholas II, for permission. The Tsar, a stickler for tradition, flatly refused. In 1902, Paul did the unthinkable. He defied the Tsar. He married Olga morganatically in a simple ceremony in Livorno, Italy. The Tsar's retribution was swift and severe. Grand Duke Paul was stripped of all his titles and military ranks. His properties were confiscated, and he was banished from Russia. He was forbidden to return. For Maria and Dmitri, this was an act of ultimate betrayal. Their father, the man who had already abandoned them to his grief, had now chosen a new wife and a new life over them. He had 3 more children with Olga, creating a new family in Parisian exile, while his first 2 children remained in Moscow, feeling more like orphans than ever before. This cemented their status as unwanted wards of the state, a painful reality that would shape their perception of family and loyalty for the rest of their lives. In this emotional vacuum, only one bond flourished, the one between Maria and her brother, Dmitri. He was just a year and a half younger, and from their earliest days, they were inseparable. They were 2 halves of a whole, partners in a silent conspiracy against the cold adult world that surrounded them. They developed their own private language, shared secret jokes, and found solace only in each other's company. For Maria, Dmitri was not just a brother. He was her anchor, her confidant, the only person in the world who truly understood the profound loneliness of her existence. This intense, almost codependent bond would become the single most important relationship of her life, a source of both immense strength and future sorrow. As Maria entered her teenage years, the ground beneath Russia was shaking more violently than ever. In 1904, the country stumbled into a disastrous war with Japan, suffering a series of humiliating defeats that shattered the myth of Russian military might. At home, discontent exploded. In January 1905, a peaceful procession of workers marching to the Winter Palace to petition the Tsar was fired upon by soldiers, killing hundreds. The event, known as Bloody Sunday, ignited the flames of the 1905 revolution. Strikes, peasant uprisings, and political assassinations swept across the empire. In Moscow, the Governor-General Grand Duke Sergei was the living embodiment of the hated regime. His uncompromising policies and iron-willed suppression of dissent made him a primary target for the Socialist Revolutionary Party's combat organization, an elite group of terrorists. On February 17, 1905, the inevitable happened. Grand Duke Sergei left the governor's palace for a meeting at the Kremlin. He was alone in his carriage. Grand Duchess Elizabeth and the children were to join him later for a concert. As his carriage passed through the archway of the Nikolskaya Gate, a young man named Ivan Kalyaev stepped forward and threw a package wrapped in newspaper directly into the Grand Duke's lap. The explosion was immense. It echoed across the Kremlin squares and was heard for miles. The carriage was obliterated, and Grand Duke Sergei was literally torn to pieces. Back in the palace, Maria, Dmitri, and their Aunt Ella were getting ready to leave when the world seemed to lurch. A deafening roar shook the building, rattling the windows in their frames. They knew instantly that something terrible had happened. Ella, her face pale but composed, simply said, "It's Sergei." She rushed out into the snow-covered courtyard without even waiting for a coat. What she found was a scene of unspeakable horror. She knelt in the bloody snow, gathering the fragmented remains of her husband. For the 15-year-old Maria and her brother, who had watched from a palace window, the event was a psychic trauma from which they would never fully recover. The abstract threat of revolution had just materialized in the most brutal way imaginable, vaporizing their guardian, and with him, the last vestiges of their childhood security. The sound of that bomb would echo in Maria's memory for the rest of her life, a visceral announcement that their world was fragile and that no wall, no matter how high, could protect them from the hatred brewing outside. In the aftermath, Grand Duchess Elizabeth underwent a profound transformation. In an act of extraordinary Christian forgiveness, she visited Kalyaev in his prison cell, not to condemn him, but to urge him to repent, offering to plead with the Tsar for his life if he did. He refused and was later hanged. After her husband's death, Ella began to withdraw from the world. She sold off her magnificent collection of jewels and personal possessions, using the proceeds to found the convent of Saints Martha and Mary, a religious community of nuns dedicated to helping the poor and sick of Moscow. While the world saw this as an act of sainthood, for Maria it was yet another form of abandonment. The aunt who had been emotionally distant was now physically and spiritually retreating into a world of prayer and charity. Once again, she and Dmitri were left behind. They were now teenage orphans, living in a house of grief, their future uncertain. They were fabulously wealthy, members of the most powerful family in Russia, and yet they were utterly alone, adrift in a country that was slowly, violently, tearing itself apart. The question now was, what would become of them? For a Grand Duchess approaching marriageable age, the answer, dictated by duty, was already being decided for her. In the courts of early 20th century Europe, the marriage of a high-ranking princess was rarely a matter of the heart. It was a complex transaction of diplomacy, power, and politics. A suitable match could strengthen an alliance, smooth over diplomatic tensions, or enhance a dynasty's prestige. An unsuitable one could cause a scandal. For a Grand Duchess of Russia, who came with a title of immense stature and a colossal dowry, the stakes were exceptionally high. As Maria blossomed from a gangly teenager into a striking young woman, the pressure began to mount. The letters between St. Petersburg and Moscow were filled with discussions of her future. Her official guardian was now the Tsar himself, Nicholas II, a man who viewed duty and tradition as sacred pillars of the monarchy. For him, and for Maria's Aunt Ella, securing a suitable husband for the young Grand Duchess was a paramount responsibility. They saw it not as forcing her into a union, but as providing her with the stability and purpose her chaotic life had lacked. They believed they were saving her. In reality, they were building her a new cage. Various candidates were considered and discarded. Then, in 1907, a perfect match appeared on paper. Prince Wilhelm of Sweden, the Duke of Södermanland, was visiting St. Petersburg. He was 23 years old, the second son of the future King Gustav V of Sweden. The match was ideal from a dynastic perspective. It would link the Orthodox Romanovs with a respectable Protestant dynasty, strengthening ties in Northern Europe. Wilhelm was of appropriate rank, and as the second son, he was not burdened with the immediate duties of an heir apparent. Wilhelm arrived in Russia and was promptly presented to the 17-year-old Maria. He was a tall, slender man with a quiet, almost scholarly demeanor. His passions were for the sea, for writing poetry, and for photography. He was, by all accounts, painfully shy and reserved, a stark contrast to the boisterous, passionate, and often brutally direct nature of the Russian court. The courtship, if one could even call it that, was a blur of protocol. Maria and Wilhelm were paraded at formal dinners and chaperoned meetings, barely exchanging more than a few polite words. There was no spark, no shared laughter, no moment of genuine connection. Maria saw a reserved and awkward stranger. Wilhelm likely saw a young, somewhat intimidating Russian Grand Duchess. But their personal feelings were irrelevant. The decision had already been made by others. The final push came from her Aunt Ella. In a private conversation that Maria would remember with bitterness for the rest of her life, her aunt laid out the expectation. It was not a request. It was a command, cloaked in the language of love and duty. Ella told Maria that this was a wonderful opportunity, that Wilhelm was a fine young man, and that it was her responsibility to accept. The underlying message was clear. After all that had been done for her, this was how she could repay the family and the state. It was time to stop being a difficult child and become a dutiful Grand Duchess. Trapped, emotionally exhausted, and with no one to turn to for support, Maria acquiesced. After knowing Prince Wilhelm for only a few hours, spread over a handful of formal occasions, she agreed to marry him. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, being moved across the board by forces far greater than herself. Her consent was not an act of will, but an act of surrender. The wedding, held at the Catherine Palace in Tsarskoye Selo on May 3, 1908, was the last great Romanov imperial wedding the world would ever see. It was a spectacle of staggering opulence, a final brilliant flare of a dynasty that was already burning out. The guest list was a roll call of European royalty. The bride, just turned 18, was a vision. She wore a traditional Russian court gown of silver satin, heavy with embroidery and trimmed with ermine. On her head glittered one of the most magnificent diadems in the Romanov collection, a kokoshnik of cascading diamonds and pearls made by Boucheron, a wedding gift from her uncle, the Tsar. But beneath the diamonds and the satin, the bride was terrified. She was a frightened girl marrying a man she did not know, about to be sent to a cold, distant land she had never visited. As she walked through the sea of glittering guests, she felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were watching a play about someone else's life. Her arrival in Sweden was a culture shock of the highest order. She had come from a world of passionate extremes, of unrestrained emotional displays, of deep piety mixed with extravagant indulgence. The Russian court, for all its formality, was at its heart deeply personal and familial. The Swedish court was its polar opposite. It was orderly, punctual, and emotionally reserved. Maria found it cold, boring, and suffocatingly bourgeois. Her new husband's family treated her with formal correctness, but there was no warmth, no embrace. She, who had been starved of affection her entire life, had arrived in yet another, emotional dessert. The marriage itself was a disaster from the honeymoon. Wilhelm and Maria had absolutely nothing in common. Her vivacity and impulsive nature were seen as undignified by the staid Swedes. His quiet introspection and shyness struck her as cold indifference and neglect. They struggled to even make conversation. Their evening were spent in silence, he reading a book, she staring out the window, the gulf between them widening with each passing day. In her memoirs, she described her husband with brutal honesty as a cold, shy, and neglectful man whose one desire was to be left alone. She was desperately lonely. She missed her brother Dmitri fiercely, writing him long, despairing letters. She found the duties of a Swedish princess to be mind-numbingly dull. Endless rounds of charity openings, formal receptions, and meetings with officials. She was a caged bird, her vibrant plumage fading in the gray northern light. In 1909, she fulfilled her primary dynastic duty. She gave birth to a son, Prince Leonard. The birth of an heir should have been a moment of joy, a chance to forge a new bond. But for Maria, it was just another link in the chain that bound her to this unhappy life. She felt a terrifying detachment from the infant. This is perhaps one of the most controversial and misunderstood aspects of her character. It is easy to judge her as an unnatural mother, but her reaction was the tragic, inevitable result of her own upbringing. She had never been mothered, never been shown the tender, unconditional love that forms the foundation of that bond. She had no template for motherhood, no emotional wellspring from which to draw. She looked at her son and saw not a source of joy, but a symbol of her entrapment. This emotional distance would define their relationship for decades, a painful legacy of her own scarred childhood. Maria's profound unhappiness began to take a physical toll. She was constantly exhausted, suffered from severe headaches, and was diagnosed with a nervous condition, a catch-all term of the era for what was almost certainly deep depression and anxiety. The royal physicians, unsure of what to do, prescribed the standard remedy for aristocratic ladies of the time, a change of scenery, a rest cure in a warmer climate. This prescription would inadvertently provide her with both a glimpse of freedom and the catalyst for her final break. She traveled south, eventually making her way to the enchanting Isle of Capri in Italy. Capri at that time was a sun-drenched haven, a bohemian refuge for artists, writers, expatriates, and aristocrats seeking to escape the strictures of their lives. For the first time since leaving Russia, Maria felt a sense of liberation. The warmth, the vibrant colors, the relaxed atmosphere. It was all a powerful antidote to the cold gray of Stockholm. Her mother-in-law, Queen Victoria of Sweden, who also suffered from poor health, had a residence on Capri, and her own personal physician, Dr. Axel Munthe. Munthe was a towering figure, not just a doctor, but a celebrity intellectual, an author, and a man of immense charisma and influence. He was deeply trusted by the Queen and many other members of Europe's elite. Maria was placed under his care. What happened next became a life-altering scandal, though it was one conducted in the hushed tones of royal circles. The details are known primarily through Maria's own account in her memoirs, and Munthe's very different self-aggrandizing version in his. According to Maria, Munthe's treatment went far beyond the professional. She alleged that he exerted a strange and controlling psychological influence over her, making inappropriate advances and manipulating her emotionally. She felt he was trying to dominate her will, playing on her vulnerability and unhappiness. The objective truth of the events is impossible to verify, as Munthe himself was a charismatic figure who offered a very different account. However, what is historically certain is that Maria perceived his actions as a profound violation, and this perception became the catalyst for her escape. She wrote to the Swedish court, lodging a formal complaint against the Queen's trusted physician. It was a bold, even reckless, move. The response from Sweden was a devastating blow. The royal family, led by her mother-in-law, closed ranks around Dr. Munthe. They implicitly and perhaps explicitly sided with him. Maria's complaint was dismissed. She was seen not as a victim, but as a hysterical, unstable, and ungrateful troublemaker. The very people who should have protected her had chosen to believe a charismatic courtier over their own daughter-in-law, a foreign princess they had never truly accepted. This betrayal was the final breaking straw. She had endured loneliness, an empty marriage, and the loss of her identity. But to be actively disbelieved and slandered when she sought help was an indignity she could not bear. Any remaining sense of duty to her husband or his family evaporated. In the warm Italian sun, surrounded by strangers, Maria Pavlovna made a cold, hard decision. She was not going to endure this life any longer. She was going to escape. A royal divorce in the early 1910s was almost unthinkable. It was a public admission of failure, a scandal that could tarnish a dynasty's reputation. It was simply not done. But Maria Pavlovna was no longer the frightened girl who had been pushed to the altar. Her years of unhappiness had forged a core of steel within her. The stubborn willfulness that had frustrated her Aunt Ella was now her greatest asset. She returned to Sweden not with a plea for reconciliation, but with a demand for her freedom. The battle was long and arduous. It was fought not in courtrooms, but in palaces, through intermediaries and strained correspondence. The Swedish royal family was horrified and did everything in their power to prevent the divorce, fearing the scandal. The Russian court, including Tsar Nicholas, was also deeply displeased, urging her to reconsider for the sake of appearances and duty. But Maria was immovable. She had endured too much. She refused to return to her husband, refused to continue the charade. She marshaled all of her Romanov pride and intransigence, and simply would not yield. Finally, faced with her unbreakable resolve, both families had no choice but to concede. On March 13, 1914, the marriage was officially dissolved by royal decree. At the age of 23, Maria Pavlovna was a free woman, but her freedom came at an almost unbearable price. The terms of the divorce were brutal. By Swedish law and royal custom, the heir, her son Lennart, had to remain in Sweden to be raised by his father as a Swedish prince. She was forced to make an agonizing choice: her own sanity and survival, or her son. She chose survival. The act of leaving her 4-year-old child behind would become the great sorrow and defining controversy of her life. It is the one act for which history, and even her own son for many years, found it difficult to forgive her. It is impossible for us to fully comprehend the anguish of that decision. She was herself still a young woman, scarred by a motherless childhood, who felt that to stay in Sweden would be a kind of living death. In her mind, she was escaping a fire, and she could not carry her son out with her. This painful separation would create a wound between mother and son that would take nearly a lifetime to heal. So in the spring of 1914, Maria Pavlovna packed her bags and boarded a train, leaving her failed marriage, her royal title as a Swedish princess, and her young son behind. She was heading east, back to Russia, back to the only real family she had ever known, her brother, Dmitri. She returned not as a triumphant hero, but as a divorcee, a slightly scandalous figure. Yet she was returning home. She did not know it at the time, but she had escaped one cage only to re-enter a much larger one, just as the doors were about to be slammed shut by history. She was returning to a Russia that was just a few months away from the guns of August, from the start of the First World War, and from the beginning of a revolution that would consume her entire world in fire and blood. The summer of 1914 was deceptively beautiful in Russia, but the assassination of an Austrian archduke in a distant Balkan city called Sarajevo lit a fuse that snaked across the continent. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. A wave of patriotic fervor, the last the empire would ever see, swept the nation. In St. Petersburg, soon to be renamed the more Russian-sounding Petrograd, crowds flooded the square before the Winter Palace, singing God Save the Tsar and kneeling in patriotic ecstasy. It seemed for a fleeting moment that the war had healed the nation's deep divisions, uniting the people and the monarchy against a common foe. For Maria, now 24, this patriotic wave offered a new and desperately needed sense of purpose. Her life as a divorcee had been awkward and undefined. The war gave her a clear mission. Like many aristocratic women, including her cousin Tsarina Alexandra and Alexandra's elder daughters, Maria was determined to contribute to the war effort. But she was not content to sit in a palace ballroom rolling bandages or lending her name to charities. The stubborn, willful girl had grown into a woman who craved genuine, tangible work. She decided to become a fully trained surgical nurse. This was a radical step. It meant shedding her Grand Ducal status for the anonymity of a nurse's uniform. It meant submitting to the rigorous discipline of medical training and the authority of doctors. She enrolled in a nursing course, and to the surprise of many who saw her as a flighty socialite, she excelled. The horrors that would make others faint only hardened her resolve. Upon completing her training, she did not seek a comfortable post in a Petrograd hospital. She requested to be sent to the front. She was stationed in Pskov, a city that served as a key military headquarters on the northern front. Here, in the sprawling, hastily erected field hospitals, she was confronted with the brutal reality of modern industrial warfare. The gilded salons of her youth were replaced by long wards filled with the stench of antiseptic, sweat, and gangrene. The polite court conversations were drowned out by the screams of men undergoing amputations without adequate anesthesia. Day after day, she worked tirelessly, cleaning horrific wounds, assisting in surgeries, writing letters home for dying soldiers, and offering what little comfort she could. This experience was transformative. For the first time, Maria was not a Romanov Grand Duchess. She was Sister Maria, a cog in a vast machine of life and death. The privilege and protocol that had defined her entire existence were stripped away, replaced by the raw, elemental facts of human suffering. She saw up close the courage and resilience of the ordinary Russian soldiers for whom she had previously been a distant, almost mythical figure. And they in turn saw her. She earned their respect not through her title, but through her hard work and her courage. Her courage became well known. In one famous account, while assisting in an operation, the hospital came under aerial bombardment. While others scrambled for cover, Maria reportedly remained steady, calming the patient and continuing to assist the surgeon. It was for this dedication and bravery that she was awarded the Medal of St. George, one of Russia's highest military honors for bravery. In the mud and blood of the front, amidst unimaginable horror, Maria Pavlovna had ironically found a sense of belonging and self-worth that had eluded her in the palaces of St. Petersburg and Stockholm. While Maria was confronting the external enemies of Russia at the front, a more insidious poison was corroding the empire from within. Back in Petrograd, the government was in a state of paralysis, and at its center was the toxic influence of one man, Grigory Rasputin. The semi-literate Siberian peasant, a holy man of immense personal magnetism and debauched habits, had gained a hypnotic hold over Tsarina Alexandra. She fervently believed that Rasputin was the only one who could control the bleeding of her hemophiliac son, the heir, Alexei. With the Tsar away at military headquarters for long periods, Alexandra, and by extension Rasputin, effectively controlled the government. Competent ministers were dismissed and replaced by Rasputin's corrupt and incompetent cronies. Wild rumors, some true, many exaggerated, of his orgies and his political machinations spread through society, destroying the last vestiges of respect for the monarchy. To the aristocracy, the Duma, and the general public, Rasputin was a cancer, and the Tsarina was his willing protector. A sense of desperation grew among the Romanov family and the high nobility. They believed that if Rasputin was not removed, he would drag the entire dynasty and Russia itself into the abyss. It was in this feverish atmosphere that a conspiracy was born, and at its heart was Maria's beloved brother, Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich. Dmitri, then 25, was a dashing and popular figure in Petrograd society. He was also a patriot, deeply troubled by the state of the country and the damage being done to his family's name. He was drawn into the plot by its charismatic and flamboyant leader, Prince Felix Yusupov, a man of fabulous wealth who was married to the Tsar's niece. Together with a few others, they concocted a plan to eliminate the Mad Monk. Their motives were, in their own minds, pure. It was not a simple murder, but a patriotic act of tyrannicide, a surgical strike to save the nation. On the freezing night of December 16, 1916, the conspirators lured Rasputin to Yusupov's Moika palace, promising him a late-night party with Felix's beautiful wife. The story of what happened next has become legendary, a Gothic horror tale of incompetence and supernatural endurance. They fed Rasputin cakes and Madeira wine laced with enough cyanide to kill several men, but he seemed unaffected. In a panic, Yusupov shot him. Rasputin fell, but later revived, crawling up the stairs and into the courtyard. He was shot again, and then brutally bludgeoned. Finally, the conspirators bound his body and threw it through a hole in the ice of the Neva River. When news of the assassination broke, Maria, still at her post in Pskov, was plunged into a state of terror. While many in Russia secretly celebrated Rasputin's death, Maria knew the Tsar, and especially the Tsarina, would see it as the ultimate act of betrayal. Her only concern was for Dmitri. She rushed back to Petrograd to find her brother a national hero in the salons, but a marked man in the eyes of the Tsar. The Empress, hysterical with grief and rage, demanded the conspirators be executed, Maria joined other members of the imperial family in signing a collective letter to the Tsar, pleading for clemency. They argued that Dmitri had acted out of misguided loyalty to the throne, but the Tsar was implacable. He saw the murder as a challenge to his authority. He refused to even read the letter. Dmitri was exiled to the remote Persian front, a punishment that felt like a death sentence. Maria was devastated, her heart broken by this forced separation from the one person she leaned on. She had a final tearful farewell with her brother before he was sent away. In a bitter twist of fate, the Tsar's angry act of retribution would become an act of salvation. By exiling Dmitri to the furthest reaches of the empire, Nicholas II inadvertently saved his life, keeping him far from the revolutionary storm that, partly thanks to Rasputin's murder, was now about to break with unstoppable force. The assassination of Rasputin did not save the monarchy. It was too late. The rot was too deep. The murder only served to further isolate the imperial couple and shatter the last illusions of unity. Just 2 months later, in February 1917, the system collapsed. The catalyst was simple: bread. Women, tired of standing for hours in freezing bread lines, began to riot in the streets of Petrograd. The protests grew, workers went on strike, and crucially, the soldiers of the Petrograd garrison, ordered to fire on the crowds, mutinied and joined them. The authority of the state dissolved overnight. The Tsar, trying to return to the capital from army headquarters, had his train stopped. On March 2, 1917, abandoned by his generals, he signed a document of abdication. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 304 years, was over. For Maria, who was in Petrograd at the time, the speed of the collapse was dizzying. One day she was a Grand Duchess in an empire. The next she was simply a citizen in a chaotic new republic. A sense of euphoria and dread warred in the streets. There was freedom, but also a terrifying uncertainty. In this vortex of change, Maria found an unexpected anchor. She reconnected with a man from her circle, Prince Sergei Mikhailovich Putyatin. He was an officer from an old aristocratic family, and in the shared danger and confusion of revolutionary Petrograd, they found solace and affection in each other. Theirs was a romance born of crisis, a small island of personal hope in a sea of national turmoil. On September 19th, 1917, they were married in the chapel of the Pavlovsk Palace. The contrast with her first wedding could not have been more stark. There were no foreign royals, no colossal dowry, no crowds. It was a simple, quiet ceremony, attended by a few family members. It was a defiant gesture of creating a new life, even as their entire world was being unmade. Their brief period of hope was short-lived. A month later, the provisional government, which had struggled to rule Russia since the Tsar's abdication, was overthrown in a swift, nearly bloodless coup. Vladimir Lenin and his small disciplined party of Bolsheviks seized power. The October Revolution was not like the spontaneous uprising of February. This was cold, calculated, and ruthless. The atmosphere in Petrograd changed instantly. The language of revolution was no longer about freedom, but about class war. Aristocrats, officers, and the bourgeoisie were now officially branded enemies of the people. A new secret police, the Cheka, was formed, and the arrests began. Life became a daily struggle for survival. Maria and Sergei were forced to abandon their family palace, which was soon nationalized. They moved into a small apartment, selling off hidden jewels piece by piece to buy food on the black market. The Grand Duchess, who had been waited on by hundreds of servants, now had to learn how to cook on a small stove and live in constant fear of the late-night knock on the door. In the midst of this mounting terror, in July of 1918, Maria gave birth to her second son, Roman Sergeyevich Putyatin. But there was no time for joy. The very same month, the world of the Romanovs came to its final bloody end. In a cellar in the city of Ekaterinburg, the Bolsheviks executed Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children. The Red Terror was officially unleashed across Russia. The news that followed was a relentless torrent of horror. Maria learned that her beloved Aunt Ella, who had become an abbess, had been brutally murdered along with several other family members. They were thrown alive down a mine shaft with grenades tossed in after them. Her talented young half-brother Vladimir Paley was among them. One by one, the people who had populated her world were being systematically exterminated. She knew, with chilling certainty, that her own name and that of her husband and infant son were on a Bolshevik death list. To stay in Russia was to die. The decision to flee was not a choice, but a necessity. Their escape was a desperate gamble, a journey into the heart of the Russian Civil War. They could not travel as Prince and Grand Duchess. They had to shed their identities, wear humble clothes, and carry forged papers. Maria's most precious possession was a document from her time as a Swedish princess. But how to hide it? As she later recounted in her memoir with remarkable ingenuity, she took a bar of soap, hollowed it out, placed the folded document inside, and sealed it again with wet soap, creating a seamless cake. This mundane object was their key to life. Their journey was a nightmare. They traveled south by train and by cart, heading for Ukraine, which was a chaotic patchwork of territories controlled by the Germans, Ukrainian nationalists, the White Army, and roaming bands of Bolsheviks. Every checkpoint was a moment of heart-stopping terror. A wrong word, a suspicious official, a search of their meager luggage could mean immediate execution. After weeks of harrowing travel, they finally made it across the border into Romania, whose Queen Marie was Maria's first cousin. They were safe. They had survived. But the cost was immense. In the relative safety of exile in Bucharest, the full scope of their losses became clear. Maria received final confirmation that her own father, Grand Duke Paul, had been taken from his sickbed and shot by a Bolshevik firing squad, his body thrown into an unmarked mass grave. And then tragedy struck a final intimate blow. Her infant son, Roman, who had survived the perilous journey, fell ill with an intestinal infection. In the makeshift conditions of exile, with limited medical care, there was little that could be done. In July 1919, exactly 1 year after his birth, he died. At the age of 29, Maria Pavlovna stood as a survivor on the ruins of her life. She had lost her country, her fortune, her entire family, and now her second child. She had escaped with nothing but her life and the clothes on her back. The Grand Duchess was gone, erased by history. All that remained was Maria, a penniless refugee in a world that no longer had a place for her. The question was no longer how to live like a princess, but how to live at all. Her greatest battle, the battle for a new identity, was about to begin. In 1920, all roads for the exiled led to Paris. The city was a dazzling, chaotic magnet for the world's lost generation. Artists, writers, and intellectuals flocked to its cafes and garrets, creating a new modern culture. And into this vibrant mix came the tidal wave of Russian émigrés, the human debris of a fallen empire. They turned entire neighborhoods like the 16th arrondissement into a little Russia. The sound of their language filled the streets, and Russian Orthodox churches with their onion domes began to rise against the Parisian skyline. Maria, her husband Sergei Putyatin, and her brother Dmitri, who had managed his own incredible escape from Persia, all made their way to this new Russian capital in exile. But it was a capital of ghosts. Here, Former princes who once commanded vast estates now drove taxis to make a living. Countesses who had hosted the most lavish balls in St. Petersburg now worked as seamstresses or salesgirls in fashion boutiques. It was a community bound by a shared, unspeakable trauma, a collective nostalgia for a world that was gone forever. For Maria, the arrival in Paris was a brutal awakening. For the first time in her 30 years, she was confronted with the harsh, mundane realities of an ordinary life. The concept of money, something she had never had to consider, was now a constant gnawing anxiety. There was rent to be paid, groceries to be bought, bills to be settled. Her education had prepared her to discuss French philosophy, to appreciate ballet, and to navigate the treacherous currents of court etiquette. It had taught her nothing about how to cook a meal, balance a budget, or find a job. The psychological shock was immense. It was a daily humiliation, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. This pressure began to expose the deep cracks in her second marriage. The shared danger that had brought her and Sergei Putyatin together in Petrograd was a poor foundation for the grinding, unglamorous struggle of life as impoverished refugees. Sergei, a man raised to be a nobleman and an officer, was utterly lost in this new world. He seemed unable or unwilling to adapt, preferring to socialize and spend what little money they had rather than confront the necessity of work. The very qualities of aristocratic nonchalance that might have been charming in a different world were now a fatal liability. The marriage began to fray, the silence between them growing heavier than the unspoken grief they both carried. Maria Pavlovna refused to be a victim. Idleness was a luxury she could not afford, and a state that was alien to her restless nature. She assessed her situation with the cold pragmatism that was becoming her trademark. What assets did she have left? Her title was a curiosity, but it couldn't pay the bills. Her real asset, she realized, was intangible. Her taste. She possessed an innate, deeply ingrained understanding of luxury, quality, and style, honed by a lifetime spent among the most opulent creations of Fabergé and Cartier. She also noticed a powerful trend in Parisian culture. The city was infatuated with all things exotic, and in particular, all things Russe. The ballets Russes had taken the city by storm, and a romanticized vision of pre-revolutionary Russia, of folk motifs, boyars, and Slavic soulfulness, was all the rage. This, she decided, was her opportunity. In 1921, with a combination of astonishing audacity and desperate necessity, she founded her own business. She called it Kitmir. According to a popular anecdote, the name was an inside joke, a nod to a minor conspirator in the Rasputin murder, a subtle link to the dramatic history she and her brother shared. Kitmir was to be a high-fashion house specializing in exquisite, handmade, Russian-style embroidery. She gathered a small workforce of other Russian noblewomen, women who, like her, had nothing left but their refined skills. In a small Parisian apartment, they set to work, their needles flashing as they channeled their memories of a lost world into intricate patterns of beads and thread. But a small workshop of talented refugees was one thing. Breaking into the cutthroat world of Parisian haute couture was another. Maria knew she needed a powerful ally. She set her sights on the very top: Gabrielle, Coco, Chanel. Chanel was already the undisputed queen of Paris fashion, a revolutionary who had liberated women from the corset and redefined modern elegance. She was also, at that time, having a passionate and well-known love affair with Maria's brother, Grand Duke Dmitri. This was Maria's entry point. She secured a meeting with the formidable couturier. One can only imagine the scene: the Russian Grand Duchess, with her imperial bearing and haunted eyes, facing the French peasant girl who had clawed her way to the top of society through sheer genius and will. It was a meeting of two worlds and two survivors. Maria presented Chanel with samples of Kitmir's work. Chanel, a perfectionist with an unerring eye for quality, was captivated. The intricacy, the artistry, the unique Slavic aesthetic, it was exactly what she needed to elevate her own Russian collection. A deal was struck. The House of Chanel signed an exclusive contract with Kitmir. It was a stunning coup. Overnight, Maria's small workshop became a vital supplier to the most famous designer in the world. The exquisite embroidery and beading that graced Chanel's iconic creations of this period were the handiwork of Maria and her team of exiled duchesses and countesses. For a brilliant, fleeting moment, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna was no longer a refugee. She was a successful entrepreneur, a player in the glamorous, high-stakes game of Parisian fashion. The success of Kitmir propelled Maria into the heart of Parisian society, but this time on her own terms. She was a fixture in the city's most exclusive salons and wildest parties, a fascinating figure who embodied both the tragic romance of the old world and the resilient spirit of the new. But as her professional life soared, her personal life fractured. The gulf between her and her husband, Sergei Putyatin, had become unbridgeable. Her relentless drive and focus on the business stood in stark contrast to his inability to adapt. In 1923, they divorced, citing a fundamental difference in attitude. It was a quiet, civilized end to a marriage that had been born in the chaos of revolution and had withered in the harsh light of exile. Once again, Maria was alone. She soon entered into a passionate affair with another giant of the fashion world, the celebrated couturier Jean Patou. Patou was a great rival of Chanel, a designer known for his glamorous, sophisticated style. For a time, Maria lived a life of dazzling glamour, shuttling between her own workshop and the opulent world of her famous lover. This was the peak of her Parisian Renaissance, a heady period of creative success and personal freedom. But the foundations of her success were precarious. The very qualities that made her a Grand Duchess, a certain aristocratic disregard for the grubby details of commerce, made her a poor businesswoman. She understood quality and aesthetics, but she struggled with payroll, managing inventory, and balancing the books. Furthermore, fashions are by their nature fickle. By the mid-1920s, the Parisian craze for Russian style began to fade. Orders from Chanel slowed and then stopped. Kitmir, which had burned so brightly, began to founder. Maria found herself sinking into debt, the pressures of the business becoming an overwhelming burden. In a final desperate attempt to find a new source of income, she tried to launch her own perfume, a scent she named Prince Igor, another nod to her Russian heritage. But the venture failed to capture the public's imagination. By 1928, the dream was over. Maria was exhausted, disillusioned, and facing financial ruin. The city that had offered her a second chance now felt like another gilded cage, one built of debt and disappointment. She had proven to herself and the world that she could work, that she could create, that she was more than just a name. But she had also learned the brutal lesson that survival in the modern world required a different kind of ruthlessness, a business acumen she simply did not possess. With a heavy heart, she sold off what remained of Kitmir for a pittance. The Paris chapter of her life was closed. She needed to escape again, to make a clean break from the ghosts of Russia and the failures of France. She turned her eyes to the West, to a land that promised a complete reinvention. The decision to move to America was the ultimate gamble. Europe was the world of her past. It was a continent of ancient monarchies and rigid class structures where she would always be seen first and foremost as the exiled Grand Duchess. America, in her imagination, was different. It was the future. It was a land of pragmatism, not protocol, a place where she hoped a person was judged not by their lineage, but by their ability. It was her last best hope for a truly fresh start. Her journey across the Atlantic was a world away from the imperial tours of her youth. There was no grand retinue, no mountain of steamer trunks. Her most important possessions were now a portable typewriter and a Russian guitar, tools for a new kind of life. In December of 1928, the ocean liner carrying Maria Pavlovna steamed into New York Harbor. As she stood on the deck, watching the jagged skyline of Manhattan resolve out of the winter mist, she was 38 years old, and she had exactly $300 to her name. The American press, always hungry for a good story, was captivated. "Grand Duchess arrives to earn a living," the headline screamed. She was an instant celebrity, a living symbol of a dramatic bygone era, but also a figure reporters could portray as a modern working woman. They were fascinated by the paradox, a Romanov who needed a job. But for Maria, standing on the docks of a strange, roaring city, the reality was terrifying. The headlines were a curiosity. Her need for rent and food was real. She was an ocean away from her brother, the only family she had left. She was completely on her own, in a city that moved at a dizzying pace. The skills she had acquired, surviving a revolution, running a couture workshop in Paris, seemed to have little currency in the fast-paced commercial world of New York. Her Parisian reinvention had ended in failure. Now on the shores of the New World, she had to ask herself the most frightening question of all. Was there anything left to reinvent? Maria understood that in America, her name was her greatest currency. It was not a key to a palace, but it was a key that could open doors. She did not have to start in a factory or as a seamstress like so many of her fellow émigrés. Her celebrity was her collateral, and she used it wisely. In 1929, she secured a position that was perfectly suited to her unique skill set. She was hired by the prestigious department store, Bergdorf Goodman, on Fifth Avenue. She was not a mere sales clerk. Her title was fashion consultant, a high-level role created just for her. Her job was to use her aristocratic eye to advise the store on its purchases of European couture and to help develop its own lines of high-quality, ready-to-wear clothing. She was, in essence, selling her taste to the new American aristocracy, the wives and daughters of bankers and industrialists. The venture was a success, bringing a dash of authentic European glamour to the store and providing Maria with a steady, respectable income. But a more profound reinvention was already underway. In the quiet hours in her modest New York apartment, she would sit at her portable typewriter and begin to weave the threads of her incredible life into a narrative. She had a story that was more dramatic than any novel, and she realized that the story itself was her most valuable possession. Encouraged by American publishers who sensed a bestseller, she began to write her memoirs. The work was grueling. It meant reliving every trauma, the death of her mother, the assassination of her uncle, the escape from Russia, the loss of her children, but it was also cathartic. For the first time, she was not just a subject of history, but its author. She was taking control of her own narrative. In 1930, The Education of a Princess was published. Its success was instantaneous and overwhelming. The book was chosen as a Book of the Month Club selection, a guarantee of massive sales and cultural impact. American readers were utterly captivated. It was a window into a lost world of unimaginable splendor, a real-life fairy tale that had ended in a brutal nightmare. But more than that, It was a deeply personal and human story of a young woman's struggle for survival. Maria's writing was direct, unsentimental, and compelling. The book became a global phenomenon. Overnight, Maria Pavlovna was transformed. She was no longer just a working royal. She was a celebrated author. The financial independence she had chased for a decade was finally hers, earned not by her title or her embroidery, but by her own words. She followed up this success in 1932 with a second volume, A Princess in Exile. Her fame grew, and she became a highly sought-after lecturer. The once shy girl, who had been terrified at the Swedish court, now stood confidently on stages in packed auditoriums across the United States, commanding the attention of thousands as she recounted her story. She had found her voice, and in doing so, had completed her most successful reinvention yet. Financial success gave Maria the freedom to finally address the most painful and unresolved parts of her past. Chief among them, her relationship with her firstborn son, Leonard. For over 2 decades, their connection had been strained, limited to occasional letters and brief formal meetings. Now she was able to travel to see him not as a struggling refugee, but as a self-assured, independent woman. In 1937, she visited him at his home, the idyllic island estate of Mainau in southern Germany. The reunion was not the warm, tearful reconciliation one might imagine. It was fraught with psychological complexity. Leonard was now a grown man with a wife and young children of his own. Maria, who had left him as a small boy, was a stranger. She was awkward and distant, particularly with her own grandchildren, to whom she showed little interest. In a moment that was deeply revealing, she asked Leonard to call her Maria rather than mother, explaining that it embarrassed her to have such a grown-up son. It was a shocking confession, revealing a woman still trapped in some ways by the trauma of her own stolen youth, unable to gracefully accept the role of matriarch. The wounds of their separation were too deep to be healed in a single visit. While she wrestled with her role as a mother, she was forced to watch as the one person who formed the core of her family, her brother Dmitri, slowly faded away. Dmitri, who had survived exile and revolution, had contracted tuberculosis. His health steadily declined throughout the 1930s. His death in a Swiss sanatorium in 1942 was the final crushing blow for Maria. He had been her twin soul, her only constant companion through the endless upheavals of their lives. His passing severed her last living link to the childhood world they had shared. Now she was truly and irrevocably alone. Adding to her personal grief was a growing political disillusionment. When the United States entered World War II, it formed an alliance with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. For Maria, this was an unholy pact. She could not comprehend, let alone accept, that the nation which had given her refuge would now shake hands with the brutal Bolshevik regime that had murdered her entire family. She saw the hammer and sickle flying alongside the stars and stripes and felt a sense of profound betrayal. The country she had adopted seemed to be legitimizing her family's killers. This feeling, combined with the pain of Dmitri's death, prompted her to seek refuge once more. In the early 1940s, she left the United States for a new, quieter exile. Maria chose Argentina as her new home. Her life in Buenos Aires was a world away from the glamour of Paris or the ambition of New York. She lived modestly in a small rented house, intentionally stepping out of the public spotlight. This was a period not of reinvention, but of reflection. She poured her energy into her lifelong passion for art. She spent her days painting and drawing, finding in the colors and lines a quiet form of expression that words could no longer provide. She had some modest success, selling her work locally and writing articles on art and design for Argentine publications. The frantic energy that had propelled her for so long finally began to subside, replaced by a calmer, more contemplative rhythm. It was here, in the quiet of her final exile, that the most important healing of her life took place. In 1947, her son Lennart traveled to Argentina to visit her. He was now a mature man of 38, the same age Maria had been when she arrived in America. This time, something was different. Perhaps it was the setting far from the ghosts of Europe, or perhaps it was simply time. But for the first time, Maria truly opened her heart to her son. As Lennart later recounted in his own memoirs, she confessed to him her profound, lifelong feeling of loneliness. She spoke of her rootless childhood, of never having a real mother or father, of being passed from one guardian to another. She told him that she had spent her entire life feeling like she didn't belong anywhere, and that this deep-seated feeling of being an outsider had made it impossible for her to be the mother he had needed. It was not an excuse, but an explanation, a raw, painful, and honest account of the wounds she carried. In that moment of vulnerability, Lennart finally saw his mother not as the cold, distant Grand Duchess who had abandoned him, but as a deeply scarred and lonely woman who had done her best to survive. The decades of resentment and misunderstanding melted away. The wound between them finally began to close. In her final years, Maria returned to Europe to be closer to her son and his growing family. She lived a quiet life near them in Germany, a constant, if still somewhat formal, presence in their lives. The restless wanderer had finally come to a stop. On December 13, 1958, Maria Pavlovna died of pneumonia in the nearby city of Constance. She was 68 years old. Her final wish was simple and poignant. She wanted to be buried next to her brother, Dmitri. Her son honored her request. Her coffin was interred in the chapel on his island estate of Minot, right beside that of her beloved brother. The two Romanov orphans, who had begun their journey together in a house of mourning, were at last reunited in eternal peace. So what is the legacy of this extraordinary woman? Her books remain her most tangible gift to history, providing an irreplaceable first-hand account of the fall of a great empire. But her true legacy is far greater than the sum of her published words. She stands as a towering symbol of 20th century resilience. In an age of unprecedented violence and upheaval, an age that saw empires vanish and ideologies clash, she endured. She was an aristocrat who learned to work, a refugee who became a best-selling author, a victim of history who refused to be defined by it. In many ways, she was an accidental feminist icon. Forced by circumstance, she entered the world of business and literature, forging a path of financial and intellectual independence at a time when women of her class were expected to be little more than decorative dependents. But to remember her as only a symbol is to lose sight of the complex, flawed, and deeply human woman she was. She was courageous and creative, but she could also be cold and remote, scarred by a childhood devoid of affection. Her life is a powerful and often painful testament to the long shadow that early trauma casts, a shadow that shaped her struggles with motherhood and her lifelong search for a place to belong. The life of Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna was an epic journey from the pinnacle of power to the anonymity of exile, from unimaginable wealth to the simple dignity of work. It was a life of profound contradictions, a princess who had to learn the price of a loaf of bread, a mother separated from her son, a survivor who never stopped searching for a home she could never truly find. She may not have found a fairy tale ending, but in the course of her turbulent, improbable, and inspiring life, she built something far more real and lasting. She did not leave behind a legacy of crowns and jewels, but an unforgettable testament to the enduring, unbreakable strength of the human spirit.